is Martin Hinsch. In this talk, I'm going to give a brief general introduction to modeling. For some problems, our brains are not equipped to handle them. We're just not able to think ahead precisely enough, so we have to use some form of formal tools, calculations. What we have in general is we have some kind of opaque reality that we find difficult to understand. We observe some aspects of the behavior of that reality. We try to copy the process that generates that behavior by implementing a model, and hopefully the behavior that that model generates is similar or identical to the behavior that we have observed. Let's assume we want to throw a ball and hit a net. Usually what we would do is we would not start calculating gravitation and friction and laws of motion and things like that, but we would use our intuition and our experience and would be usually quite fine with that. On the other hand, if we want to send somebody to the moon, as we can see on the right hand side, we would be quite mad to use intuition or experience alone. Instead, we would take recourse to a huge set of tools in the form of physical laws and calculations, approximate methods, computers, and so on, since otherwise we would not be able to do that without probably the entire thing ending in a disaster. There are two types of models that I want to talk about. First, predictive models, and then explanatory models. This is the cases of COVID-19 in parts of China and the rest of the world at the beginning of this year. As we all know, governments have since then struggled to contain the pandemic and to find ways to minimize fatalities while at the same time keeping the economy on track. And the way they're doing that is usually by employing some kind of modeling. So this, for example, is a very, very simple classic epidemiology model. It's called an SIR model, with a susceptible, an infected, and a recovered or removed population. Models like that, in a much more sophisticated form, have actually been used in the real world by governments to find out which scenarios would be most advantageous. So what they do is they use that model, they plug in different initial conditions, then test how the pandemic evolves and see which scenario works best under given boundary conditions. And from that they can then deduce which measures to take. So predictive modeling means we want to predict how a process behaves under given conditions. Our intuition is not sufficient to let us predict the process well enough. We do not know enough to describe the process precisely, so we have to approximate. And that approximation is then used as a prediction of the behavior of the real process. The Melior experiment, performed by Stanley Miller in 1952, was an attempt to explain how life originated on early Earth. And what he did was essentially he took two glass flasks. One of them he filled with water, the other one with a few basic chemicals, and assumed to reflect the conditions on early Earth, and then connected them, heated the water, and regularly sent sparks to the other compartment. And that setup he let run for a couple of days or a week. And after that you see this brown sludge developing, and what he found was that this sludge actually contains 5 of the essential amino acids that make up every single living being on Earth. Explanatory modeling really means that we observe a phenomenon, we have an idea of the conditions that may cause this phenomenon, so the conditions that have to be prevalent and the causality that causes the behavior that we observe. but our intuition is insufficient as a proof, so we can't just conclude from that idea that it has to be true. Therefore, we need to replicate the conditions in some kind of approximate representation, either formal or physical, and then run it to see if the behavior that we observe, that we want to prove, actually occurs in that representation. In the first class of models that we looked at, so the predictive models, what we're interested in is actually trying to replicate that behavior as accurately as possible. So we want to know exactly if we change the conditions a bit, how is the behavior going to change? Or if we just look at the future, how is the behavior going to be in the future? Which means that in a predictive model, we are actually not really interested in the upper part of the process. We can, in principle, ignore that entirely. And there are actually cases where people have done that. So instead of implementing a model of a process, they have used, for example, artificial neural nets to directly predict the future behavior or alternative behaviors from the observed behavior. Now, if we look at the other type of model, the explanatory model, the situation is slightly different. What we're interested in here is, of course, the behavior, but only insofar as it tells us something about the process that's happening. So we want to know how this part up here, the complicated reality, generates the behavior that we observe. And to do that, what we have to do, since we can't observe that part directly, we don't really have a handle on it in most cases. That's the reason why we start modeling in the first place. What we have to do is we have to pick parts of that process that we think is relevant for our observed behavior, since we can't really look at it directly, implement it in a model, and then see whether the behavior we get out of it is similar to the behavior we have observed. And the thing we can prove with that structure is that if we find one particular implementation of that process that generates behavior that is similar to the one observed, that this is a sufficient logical structure to generate that behavior. So in the end, what this type of model really does, it serves as a proof of concept that demonstrates that one particular mechanism is sufficient to cause a specific type of behavior. And finally, the only thing a model can really show is the consequences of a set of assumptions. That is all it can do. So it really depends on the right question. Thank you for listening.